Welcome to Just to Know You, the podcast that interviews regular people at SAES and finds out they are far from regular.
That's right. I'm your host, Darian Batten.
And I'm Angela Kerskaden.
Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to Just to Know You podcast. I am joined by two guests today that I've been very excited to interview, and I'm glad our times finally worked out today. I have Martin Herman and his lovely wife, Carole, and you're going to have to help me with your last name.
Carole Henriot. It's a hard one.
Aren't you Canadian?
Yeah, I know. I am supposed to be Canadian, but I appreciate it. Yeah, thank you. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited to today talk about your journey and how you got to SAES. And then also I would love for us to chat about raising trilingual children. We'll kind of take it from the beginning. Maybe I'll start with you, Martin. Tell me about where you come from and where you grew up. Okay, and you know what? I'm just remembering that I should probably mention to the listeners that you are currently, both of you currently teach at Ross-Tenor Middle School. So you're kind of just down the road from me.
All right. I am American, originally from Dallas, Texas. And I get a lot of people that expect Texans to speak differently than I do. And I try to tell people that Dallas is a lot more diverse than people think. And they're not all cowboys. But I also come from a kind of bicultural, bilingual family myself. And my father was German, and he immigrated to the U.S. in the late 50s. And my mother was Argentinian, and she immigrated to the U.S. in the late 60s. And they met in Dallas, and that's kind of my background. And I was lucky to grow up bilingual and speak Spanish and English. I didn't live with my father since my parents divorced, but I got a light dose of German on weekends when I saw him. But then he sent me to summer language schools in Germany when I was in high school, and I eventually became fluent in German. It helped that I had family living there that I could spend time and visit. So I lucked into being multilingual.
Oh, that's wonderful. So at home, your mom spoke to you in Spanish, and then
I spoke English with my dad growing up until I learned German fluently in high school, and then we switched into German and never switched back into English again.
Where did you go after high school?
I stayed in Texas and went to school in Austin, but I started already doing study abroad and exploring my future career as an international teacher without knowing it, and had a summer in Russia, a semester in Germany, a semester in Spain, and then before graduate school also had a year in Germany again. So I was in Texas, but I was dipping in and out of Texas through study abroad programs, and then went to graduate school in Arizona, and then moved to Houston, and then the story gets interesting finally.
It sounds interesting so far. When you were doing all of your studying abroad, was that all in education?
No. I was studying geology. So I was doing basically my bachelor's in geology, but I was taking the courses in German or in Spanish.
Oh, wow.
In Russia was just language. When I was in Russia, it was just to try to learn Russian. How
did that go?
Not too well, because I didn't have a strong background when I first got there, and I learned a lot more when I came back, but it was sort of too early for me. So my Russian is still a beginner level Russian.
Well, it's amazing that you have any. At this point in your life where you've kind of zoomed us through your high school years to college, you speak Spanish, German, and English and a little bit of Russian right now.
I studied Russian, but
okay.
It's weak, but I like trying anyway.
All right. I'm going to jump over to Carole. Where do you come from?
So I was born and raised in France, so I'm 100% French. I'm not as exciting as Martin. So I grew up in France. In France, I guess in high school, you sort of study the area, you choose the area of studies that you want to do. And so languages was my forte, I would say. So I studied in high school, particularly. I studied English, Spanish, and German, never to the extent of Martin. But then I knew that I wanted to do something with English. So after high school, I my parents knew that I wanted to speak fluently English. So we did some research, and I went right after high school to the US for what was supposed to be a year for me to learn English. So I went to Texas, and I went, I guess, because from France, where education is free, going into the US required me to have to pay out of state, out of everything, tuition. So that was really expensive. And after research, we figured that Central South US is where colleges seem to be cheaper. So my parents sent me for 1 year to a community college in East Texas for cultural discoveries.
Not too far from Dallas, interestingly enough.
An hour, yeah. Was it an hour or maybe 2 hours from
1.5,
Dallas?
something like that.
So I went to East Texas, and and after a year, I said, well, I'd like to stay. I would like to continue studying in the US. I really loved it. And my parents, my mother particularly, said, well, if you're going to stay, then you have to complete a degree. So you have to then, I guess, do 4 years. The place where I was a community college, so you could only do 2 years, which took me a little longer because I had a whole first semester of English as a second language. So I did 2 years and a half there, and then I transferred to Louisiana, which was another state where tuitions are not so expensive, and it wasn't far because I was on my own. So I wasn't going to go across the country, so I moved to LSU and I continued to study there. So I studied English. And then once I had English under my belt, then I was like, this is kind of boring. So I started to take classes in Spanish, and that became more exciting. I also moved in with my roommates were all from South America because the community in LSU had a lot of international students. So I picked up Spanish, and I double majored in that. I also studied French literature there and got a scholarship. Don't tell the Louisiana state that I got a scholarship as a French person. It was, to be fair, it was a scholarship that promoted French. So it was all about promoting French. But then when I finished, I tried to get a job as a teacher, but it was hard because I couldn't get something right straight out of with my bachelor's. So I went back and did a master's degree at LSU. And then after that, again, searching for work, I looked close by because on my own, I couldn't move too far away. So I started working in Houston, and I taught there for 5 years. And then after those 5 years, I was like, okay, I've got to do something else. I've always wanted to go to South America. So I applied for international schools in South America, but ended up in Thailand after that. So I guess that's where we sort of join up in our stories.
That's what my next question was. Tell me when when you've come together. It was in Thailand?
No, actually, right before I was signed to move to Thailand, and Martin and I had met a couple of times, but we started dating then, and so I guess it became more serious. So I moved to Thailand, and he stayed in Texas for 6 months. We decided to try it for real. So he took a sabbatical from his geology work that he never went back to. And Martin and I had met a couple of times, but we started dating then.
And you were both in Houston. Okay. And then you were working as a geologist.
Right.
And so when do you become a teacher?
In Thailand, 6 months after she moved, I moved. And then 6 months after that, I signed up for a program to get certified and get a master's in education. And I could do it online during the school year in Thailand, but I had to do summers in residence in the state of Virginia. And so I was lucky because in Thailand, there's enough schools that have demands for teachers that with a background in geology the school said, okay, you're signed up for an education program and you have a degree in geology, so we can let you do some math science, you can do some ESL, and they trusted me with the background that I had to say, okay, you've given us enough to say you can work even though you're not certified. But again, it was a very, very, very small international school, 80 kids, pre-K through 12, that I got my first opportunity.
And then since you've been overseas teaching, what countries have you taught at?
So we stayed in Thailand for 6 years. Then we moved to Turkey for 4 years, moved back to Thailand after that for another 2 years, and came here 4 years ago.
Okay. Now, knowing how linguistic you are, how is your Thai and Turkish? Say that right? Yeah.
So I would definitely say, like, I thought I was good with languages, and then I met Martin, so he kind of just...
No, we have different styles. I'm a book learner, so I read the grammar book at the beach, and she's a street learner. So she picks up what it takes me a year to pick up in a book. If she's got the right street environment, she'll pick it up in a week. But when you're in an international community, it's hard always to get into those communities of native speakers and locals. So I'm at a slight advantage because I can always break into the book, whereas she might not break into the local community.
Yeah, the books don't attract me as much, for sure. I'm a practical learner. Yeah. But our Thai in Thailand, I mean, we were there a total of 8 years with a good 6 years single with no family requirements. And there were a lot of, we lived in the center of the city. There was a lot of exchanges with the community and in the environment. So our Thai, I would say, is the strongest, out of all the countries where we've lived, because after that, either there was, here there's so very little contact with Arabic speakers, or it defaults to English right away because the community we're around is educated and they're educated in English. So there's very little exchanges there. And then Turkey, I think we had 2 kids, and we became parents, and those were the early ages where we couldn't really spend that much time interacting with Turkish.
But, yeah, those were busy days.
Yes, they were really busy days. But yes, I would say the Thai is, and Martin is, those first 6 months when he joined me and he wasn't working, he was on my sofa in his Thai book.
So good for you.
I was like, who's this dude that's just sleeping on my sofa and he spends his days studying Thai?
My charm wore off quick.
You're like, I don't know about this guy.
Yeah, touch and go there for a minute.
When you look back on all, like, you have a lot of chapters in your lives, like, I think some people, they just kind of they have bigger chunks of it. You've been on the move a little bit. When you look back into your life at your different chapters, which chapter do you look at with kind of the fondest memories, and which chapter has been like the hardest? I'll start with you, Martin.
As Carole mentioned, she hinted at the fondness already, that in Thailand we spent 6 years pre-kids.
Right.
And so there was a lot of flexibility, a lot of let's drive to the beach this weekend, and a lot of exploration that we did, that I'm not sure if we've ever matched that kind of activity and exploration and digging into the culture. And of course, no fault of our kids. We love them dearly, but
of course.
It's a lot more challenging to get around and to take places. And when you've got 3, the plane tickets add up fast. And so that's but again, I guess I would say that from that sort of, when you think about one of the big reasons you go overseas as a international teacher, is about the cultural understanding and the cultural learning, is I think we probably had the most of that in Thailand. And so that to me is, I think there's always going to be a sort of a special place that we haven't been able to do the same in other countries quite as deeply. And we always think like, that we finished, but we barely scratched the surface.
I would, yeah, definitely like that. As a person, I don't like to have favorites. I feel like people always ask, like, what was your favorite country? What's your favorite food? I'm just like, every country, every experience is very special. So I would say that, there's always been something that we can look back for each of our experiences. There's something to cherish and look forward to. I agree, obviously, with Martin. We, as a couple being together as singles in Thailand, there's so many adventures that we were able to have. But I was also a single independent woman in the US for 10 years. And I've had, I look back on those 10 years in the US as so rich because I learned, I learned all about the American culture, not all the culture, but I learned a lot about the American culture. I learned English. I also became a Spanish speaker in the US, and I learned a lot about the Central South American culture without ever traveling there because of my community. And then when I started to work in the US, in Houston, I was able to travel to South America. So to me, those are very special memories in my book as well, with before Martin. So
What?
yeah, there were some good times.
What was it about America to you that that appealed to you at that age and at that time? Because I imagine there must have been some very noticeable cultural differences moving from France to America, especially all on your own. But what is it that you loved about it?
I think it's that naive perception that every teenager has. Like I go back to France and I hear like in America you can be anything you want. You can do everything. It was that freedom. It was just like this perception that the US is better. But really it was the language. The language I just wanted I wanted to be a native speaker. I wanted to speak fluently. Like small anecdote, but when I moved to this small community college, we went through this association and it ended up being this French guy. There were in that small place, there were 23 French people. And I landed there and I was like, wait a minute, I'm going to the US to be immersed. And there's all these French people around me. And I became like the black sheep because I was like, sorry, I'm not talking to you. So I was like, I never spoke to them for that whole year. But I was like, I'm paying a lot of money to be here to learn English. I don't want to hang out with you guys.
Well, that's amazing because that.
I was going to say we've met a couple of them since then, years later, and none of them speak as good English as Carole does.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, honestly, I mean, that would have been so easy, right? It's comfortable hanging out with people that you don't have to think about it. I mean, I do not speak another language, but when I was traveling through Central America, I went to Spanish school and then I came home and lived with a family for a little bit. I was exhausted because we were at school all day learning and then came home and then you're trying to be polite and speak at the dinner table and then do your homework at night. I can't imagine how you did that for years. Like it's exhausting to learn a new language, isn't it? Okay. So here's a question that I always, every time I see you guys like walking on the path or on the beach or like, I'm always like, what language are they speaking to each other? So what language do you two communicate to one another?
So we speak Spanish. That's how we met. We met, through the Spanish speaking community in the US. And that was sort of the charm from
my selling point.
That was his selling point. He sold himself as I don't know if I can say this here. No, I don't think I can. Like the Latin lover. And I later learned that he was just a German. Not quite as exciting.
Not yet. Let's have a growth mindset.
So you guys communicate in Spanish. So now I want to talk about your family, and you guys have just to let the listener know, you have 3 kids. Can you remind us of the ages of your children?
Yeah, Thomas just turned 11. Olivia is 8.5. She'll tell you, and Mateo is almost 7. We go every 2 years, basically.
And so before Thomas was born, did you ever have a conversation about what language you will speak to him in? Did you have many conversations? Was this a debate? Or was this an easy decision?
I think it was pretty clear that we were going to keep all three languages. That's sort of, I mean, it's our passion, both of our passions. So it was pretty clear that I had to pay money and work, like you said, like so hard. Martin was born bilingual and like he worked for his German, but it was a gift. Whereas like I worked hard, this wasn't given. And so we said, of course, we will give them as many languages as they can.
And so how do you raise trilingual children? What is it that you do?
We struggle.
This cannot be easy.
Yeah, especially when when the language of Rastanura is English and the language of the school is English, and they interact in English at school. So it's an uphill battle all the time.
I think you have to have faith that, in the long run, we've met enough people that were raised with parents that, taught them a second language. And they say, it was so hard and I hated my parents, but then I'm so grateful that they resisted and they kept at it and they maintained, because now I have that language. So we know that it's hard work, but we know that it pays off.
What language do they watch TV in?
Thanks to Netflix and Disney Plus these days having all these languages, we sort of made this little rule saying, like, when we watch movies, it's got to be not in English. Even if the movies aren't originally in French or Spanish, we watch the dub version of it. And but then if they watch on their own, or if they're on a plane, obviously they're going to choose English. Although sometimes, I can quickly snap it into French or Spanish on Mateo and before you get there and be like, okay. But so for that, we've tried to, that's one of the things where we said, okay, and we can sort of reason with them and say, kids, we've got to do it in those languages because you've got to get some extra practice. So that's that for TV and movies, we try to use French and Spanish.
Okay. And then, so I should have mentioned this because I think I know it. So Carole, when you communicate with your children, you always do it in French.
Correct.
And then Martin, when you communicate with the children, you always do it in Spanish.
Mm-hmm. And because Carole knows Spanish, she can pick up everything that goes on when I'm speaking Spanish. And I've, over 15 years, have gotten good enough French, especially when she was raising the kids in French, to follow along all the conversations.
Okay.
So we have kind of multilingual conversations.
I was going to ask you about your French. Like when you guys travel to France, Martin, can you survive on your own and go get groceries and like communicate and find?
He's fluent. He's fluent now.
Okay. So
I've kind of learned French the way that Carole would learn best. Is I've just picked it up there on the streets and with family, and through the patience and grace of the family when I sit in silence for years and then start talking a little bit and then a little more. And 15 years later, I'm like, oh, I can say this stuff now.
Yeah, that's
like
amazing.
That's gotten me close enough. But my kids can probably speak and understand much better French than me.
Right.
I might have them on reading, but I can follow along when she speaks in French.
And so your books at home are always French or I mean, what do you do when they bring home their books from school and they have to practice their books from school, but you also want them to be reading in Spanish and in French?
Our reading time at night is very complicated and long. And it's a long process because it used to be we had all the kids in one room for a long time, because then they would read their book. Maybe when Thomas started reading, he might read a book, and then we would switch, and I would read a book in English, and Martin would read a book in French or Spanish. And now they're all three are reading, so we let them read at their own pace. They read in English, and then we jump and take turns and go and read at least a book or a chapter or something to each one of them, whether it's in French or Spanish. They might have gotten 2 languages a night. Now it's like one parent comes and we read in whatever we can.
I imagine this has got to be
Yeah,
difficult.
in the beginning, because we were so motivated to let them hear our languages, we would actually, it didn't matter what book we picked up and what language it was, we would read it to them in the language we spoke to them in.
Yeah, we
So
did.
we would have English
Ah.
books, and we would be translating it as we read it, so we would read it in English, but it would come out of our mouth in French or Spanish. So
What
our
if it
kids
was
would just
what if
hear
it was
that.
a rhyming book?
Ah.
It lost a lot of the magic.
Okay.
It didn't rhyme in French and Spanish. And don't tell
Right.
our kids it ever did in English, all right?
I'm sure they had no idea. I'm sure it was still magical.
It did affect me though. I remember several times making, just doubting because I was like, but this is the beauty of reading, a kid's book is the rhyme and the use of the words. Like there's so much power to that. And us translating it, I was like, I don't know that we're doing them a favor because we're, in a way we're stealing their vocabulary in English that they need for school. We're not giving them that by translating it. So I think that was definitely a battle to choose.
Are you at all concerned, or do you work on just kind of like spelling or those kinds of things in Spanish and French and writing, or are you kind of just working on like auditory and?
So initially, when Thomas started to read, I started to do a little bit of phonetic reading for him in French. I haven't been able to maintain it just for what we just said. Like there's too much reading with too many kids with too many languages. We got to choose our battles. And then I think we had always said French because I have family, because we travel to France. We've sort of maybe admitted or accepted that French is going to be their second strongest language. They have more input in French than in Spanish. This is the one that's hard because we want them to be able to read and write more in it, but I haven't been able to sustain the lessons. However, I finally found a teacher, and just for this podcast, I can now say they're taking French lessons. They had one lesson. And the fascinating part is because we've been reading to them. So for me, I'll just say that I've been reading to them in French, and they read with us, right? They are looking at the images. So they I think, been able to learn to read over my shoulder. And even though, we never hear them really read out loud in French, but when I read now to Thomas, I know he's reading with me because he'll correct me. He says, no, that's not what this character is saying. So he reads over, but as we know, French is challenging, the phonetics, the accents, the sounds. So even though they can read, there's some words that they get stuck on. And that's why I wanted them to also have the lesson so that they can learn the detail of it. But it's hard for me to sit down and find the time to actually teach them that.
You did leave out, though, that in the summers, that there's a very light work we do with them, because France has a culture of summer workbooks that are supposed to be grade level appropriate and light, fun activities, but still cover lots of different subjects. They're short, they're light, and so our kids are not up to grade level, but we can always find some grade level that works for them, and then kind of walk them through a page a day type of thing. And that's sort of the model they're designed for, like a page or two a day. And so that's where they've gotten some exposure to.
That takes a lot of effort in your summertime to say, all right, come inside, let's go leave the beach early or whatever.
It's hard to be consistent with it, but some summers are better than others in just getting, it depends on the mood. But if one kid is, selling it as, I want to do it, then they all want to do it. But just like that lesson from last week, the teacher sent some reading, and, I was listening to them read to her, and it was very like hesitant and challenging. And then I printed those reading and I read with them last night, and I was blown away how, like, they can read it. Of course they get stuck on a couple words, but it was much better with me than it was with her. I think they were a bit intimidated. Yeah, it gives me really hope that they're going to be able to grow from that if we can keep these lessons happening.
Yeah.
I'm also not too focused on Spanish because Spanish is in terms of reading and writing, Spanish is very much, it's a much more what you see is what you get language when it comes to reading it and writing it than French is. And I actually, much like my kids, I only spoke Spanish and wrote a little bit until I was in high school. And then I jumped into like Spanish as an 11th and 12th grader, exact for the purpose of being able to read and write it. And it's such a, like the sounds and the letter correspondences are so straightforward compared to French that our kids can almost do it already without ever having been taught to read Spanish. They can decode it and they figure it out. They're kind of like, oh, this is that and that's that. Whereas in French, you need to know a little bit more about what letters make what sound and what combinations do.
How often does it happen to you guys and your children where you mean to say something and you say it in a different language?
I think that happens to me a lot more than Martin. He's really, really good at, his Spanish is also stronger, so he will really stick to it. So our agreement in the family is that when we're together, I speak a little bit more Spanish. As you mentioned earlier, by the end of the day, I've taught in French, there's been English, and Spanish is definitely out of the three. That's going to be my weaker language. And by the evening come, my brain is tired and I can't find the words. So it's often that I will struggle at night and just think this would come so much easier to me in English. And so I will be the one that break and use English sometimes too, because I'm just tired.
Yeah, sure.
We also do, I think, what most multilingual speakers do is we do a lot of sort of like random insertions of words that for whatever reason that word is a context that it's more French or it's more English, and we'll use it. And sometimes that's convenience, and sometimes it's just because that's the context. A language can be a context for a certain word or something. But our kids, on the other hand, they'll switch languages a lot because they're still kind of they don't think as much about it. So whatever comes out easiest is most likely to come out, and we have to remind them a lot. Yeah, you'll hear us being the sort of strict, like we're always going to speak Spanish and French. Then they're going to be speaking English with a mix of French and remember to speak in Spanish to me and okay. And then they start in Spanish and then eventually it somehow switch back into English.
It is a battle. Like it is a challenge every meal that, Martin is, very strict with that. And he'll say like, Inglés o español, español o francés. And it's so hard to push it because that means every sentence we have to just ask them to say it again. And they don't want to do it. They've already said what they wanted to. So they don't want to have to repeat it again in French. Or Martin will just like translate what they just said. And it really is. We're Google translators, constantly. So that's a lot of effort. So everything is longer. Our meals are longer.
Can you tell me more about like you have to you translate what they say? Like if they say it in, can you explain that a little bit more?
I don't actually know if that even works, but basically what I do is if they will say something to me in English, I'll repeat it, but I'll say it in Spanish.
So if they say, can I go outside and play in English? You will say, are you asking me if you want to go outside and play? Like you'll say it back in Spanish?
Yeah, more or less. It's kind of the equivalent of if you're with your children, you want them to say please and thank you, or you want them to say things in the politer way. Sometimes you'll model it and you'll say it in the polite way, like, you mean this? And then the implication is now you're going to repeat what I just showed you how to say so that you're now speaking politely or using the word thank you or something. So that's kind of the model I'm using. But again, it's I think it's harder on Carole than it is on the kids. Yeah.
That's amazing. And what about like when they were infants and you were speaking two languages and when they came to school, they would probably have only spoken Spanish and French. Like, was it difficult for them to categorize the, like, oh, this is French, this is English, and this is Spanish? Or do you think they kind of just figured that out?
I have a memory of that question when we left Turkey, specifically because it blew my mind. Thomas was about 2.5 when we left. No, he was older. He was maybe 3.5, somewhere on there. And he, at that point, his only English came from his nanny, who was Filipino. She was the only person he spoke English with. So his English was very minimal, and just he used it with her. Again, me Spanish, Carole French, and we had put him in a local school. So from 20 months on, Thomas went to a little Turkish day. It was called a school, but it wasn't too academic. It was just, that's what it was. And so when we and the school would always tell us, they're like, he's not fluent. He can't produce as much as the kids his age and the Turks, but he understands everything we tell him. And he would say some things to them. If his mind had a context compartment for it, like, this is my Turkish school, so it happens in Turkish. This is the nanny I speak English with, so it happens in English. This is my dad who I speak Spanish with. And it didn't seem to short circuit his brain. It just, obviously, it would take longer to develop because he's juggling 4 at the same time. And it really did seem like if that was school, then that was Turkish.
I had no idea that Thomas was learning Turkish. I taught, this is just for the listeners, I taught Thomas in 1st grade. And I remember a day where he's like, it was a science word. And he said, I don't know this word in English. And then I was like, well, I took a little Spanish and I took a little French. So I was like, hit me with it. And he said it in Spanish. And I was like, I don't know that one. So then he said it in French. And I was like, nope, sorry, I am no help. We're going to go Google this. But I mean, like, it was just so cool. I think I went home and told Kevin that story because I was like, how cool. This kid knew it in 2 other languages, but we had to figure out what it was in English.
So, every school year you get to ask, you can fill out the survey at school without saying, what teacher you want, but you can have a note. And mine has always been for all of them, if they can have somebody who has a language. So this year, Mateo, he had Andres last year, and then this year he has Miss De La Rey. And I think she uses a lot more Spanish because she's got maybe 5 Spanish speakers in her class. So she uses it a lot. And I don't know if that's, I think it weighs for him because he has somebody else other than, dad or me sometimes speaking Spanish, and it's showing him the value that it's practical, right? He's using it in the context of school. And we've watched him using a lot more Spanish this year. How old was he when he was saying like he didn't speak it?
Thomas?
Mateo.
Oh yeah. He jokes that maybe a year or 2 ago he was like, but how can I speak Spanish at the table? Or he said something, but I don't speak Spanish, Dad. But he was saying it in Spanish.
Oh.
There was one kid, I think actually it was Olivia, that we took to France one summer, and she was like, I don't understand French. I don't speak it. And after that summer, it made all the difference. Like, the impact our summers have on them is incredible. And that's why we continue to, we split our summers. We started since we were here, going part of it in Spain and part of it in France. And in the summers, not only are we in Spanish or French speaking, but in France, and Spanish started last year, we were able to sign them up for summer camps so that they're in a social environment also that allows for them to use their languages. And that makes, I think, that's all the difference.
We've seen a lot of growth when they come back from summer camp after a week or spending the days there, that they sound like little Spaniards.
I just think what you guys are doing is incredible. It's such an amazing gift that you're giving to your children. And I know you said it, but I know that I know one day they're going to thank you. They will be so grateful for just this amazing ability to just grow up speaking 3 languages. I've already taken a lot of your time, but I have one last question. In middle school at Rustanura Middle School, will they take Arabic class as their language?
I think it's fortunate that they are going to learn Arabic, because then we finally will get a chance to like learn it ourselves, which we
Right.
haven't. And so we can look over there and be like,
There
"Now
you go.
Arabic." So
They're going to be teaching you some language.
that's right.
Well, you guys are just super interesting, and I've always kind of knew kind of bits about you and your past and everything, and so this has just been really wonderful and interesting for me, and I know other people are going to just enjoy your story as much as I have. Thank you so much for your time today, and I can't wait for this podcast to come out. This episode's going to be fantastic.
That was fun.
Thank you very
Thank you as well.
much.
Thank you for listening to Just to Know You.
We would like to thank our amazing tech man, Mr. Kent Arimura, Sterling McDonald for the podcast music, and the SAES community. See you next time.
If you know anyone who you think has a great story to tell, we would love to hear about it. Please send an email to either Angela, Darian, or Kent.